Repetition. Nari.
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 Avatar.
Nari.
Nari.
Last of the Dogmen.
Don't move.
Does breathing count?
Little Big Man.
Grandfather, I think it's a good day to die.
Last of the Mohicans. Dances with Wolves.
Across all these films, we find one major commonality. Can you guess it? Each film has a white character who chooses to renounce aspects of their own white cultures and embrace the ideals and culture of a native tribe or of a native people.
Traditionally, the relationships between Native Americans and whites in cinema have been anything but friendly. The prevalent theme of cowboys versus Indians in the earliest westerns villainized Native Americans living and fighting for the land the white settlers were often trying to rip from their grasp. As Jeremy Agnew, the author of The Creation of the Cowboy Hero, puts it, the counterpart of the fictitious Hollywood cowboy was the fictitious Hollywood Indian. The iconic Hollywood image of the Indian is a painted, bare-chested native with a feathered hairdress riding bareback on a painted pony. This was the generalization of a few characteristics taken from only a few Native American tribes, mostly from the Indians of the Great Plains. Later in the history of cinema, an uneasy truce began to blossom as filmmakers dropped a few, but not all of the misconceptions surrounding them. Backstories, families, and a coherent language that was more than a series of grunts and mumbles emerged amongst Native American communities. On top of that, white characters have been attempting to integrate themselves into Native American culture. This has been shown in a multitude of ways, the most popular being induction into a tribe, marriage or union with a maiden or bachelor, or a simple alliance in the face of war. Agnew goes on to say, Indians were generally shown as shrieking savages until Broken Arrow. Films were rarely presented from the Indian point of view until Dances with Wolves, when Native Americans were changed into a wronged and noble people.
At face value, this plot point seems only positive. What's not to like about the friendly congregation of two races? Digging deeper, however, we may find that this furthers the perpetuation of stereotypes against Native peoples in ways previously unimagined.
The use of the theme of the embrace of Native culture by white characters in film has many positive qualities. If perhaps a white character accepts and adopts Native culture in a film, the effect is that the white members of the audience may feel they too can embrace Native culture. This is especially important because many Western films created and continue to create a barrier between white and Native cultures. But through films that involve a white character adopting Native culture, the Native culture, instead of being alienated from that of the whites, is placed in an atmosphere of acceptance. Even though, as a society, we should not need a signal to accept others, that is, in a way, what these embracing Native culture films can be. For example, through films such as Dances with Wolves, Last of the Dogmen, Little Big Man, Last of the Mohicans, and Avatar, the whites' adoption of Native culture has translated into society's acceptance of Native culture. What does becoming Native or adopting Native culture actually look like? In Kevin Costner's 1990 film, Dances with Wolves, Lieutenant Dunbar finds himself on the western frontier in an abandoned military outpost. He gradually befriends a neighboring Sioux tribe, and they name him Dances with Wolves. The notable scene in Dances with Wolves in which Lieutenant Dunbar, the white man, marries Stands with a Fist, an essentially native woman, exemplifies such acceptance. Dances with Wolves did and does a tremendous job in its use of encouraging the audience to accept Native culture. In Last of the Dogmen, the idea is the same. Lillian Sloane, one of the two main white characters, constantly emphasizes the positive qualities of the Cheyenne culture. Similarly, throughout James Cameron's film Avatar, the audience is persuaded to relate to the natives. Avatar is about the resistance and struggle of the natives of the planet Pandora, called the Na'vi, against the corporate military that threatens to take their land. Drawing many parallels with Native Americans and the United States, the film is seen as a modern anti-imperialistic Western. Even though the audience may not notice the influence such scenes and films can have, the effect is alive. films such as those discussed do encourage an acceptance and embracement of Native culture in a positive manner.
Another positive aspect of adopting the native cultures is highlighting the negative part of current culture and society through a former member, bringing self-awareness and attention to the problems. When a white person chooses native culture over current culture, the audience gets to see white culture as antagonist force through the perspective of the newly native protagonist. In Jane Cameron's Avatar, Jake Sully is the medium in which we are allowed to negatively view white imperialistic culture. The audience starts to ally with the natives and what they stand for, which is the opposite of what the whites represent. This is unusual for the majority of movies and media, since usually the character isn't against a whole culture, especially not white culture. From switching over to the noble natives, we can finally view white culture as antagonists, with its materialism goal of finding unobtainium outweighing human and native lives. But Avatar isn't the only movie that showcases white culture in a bad light. Dances with Wolves also highlights the evil of white culture. When Lieutenant Dunbar joins native society and realizes the barbaric practices of the white military, the military is shown in a different light, as racist and wrong. We associate and relate with Dunbar, and therefore we see the evils he sees. Being self-aware is very important to avoid oppressing other cultures. According to Linda Elkoff, a philosophy professor and author of What White People Should Do, realizing these evils helps a nationwide movement against racist institutions and even decolonizes the master narrative that we have unwittingly followed.
Whites are oftentimes portrayed as having undesirable qualities in The Last of the Mohicans as well. Although white culture itself seems to be structured in an effective way, the people who embrace that culture are deeply flawed. The movie depicts the 7 Years' War that took place in 1757. The protagonist is a white man by the name of Nathaniel Hawkeye, who has been adopted and raised by the Mohican Chingachgook. Although white by definition, Nathaniel's actions completely go against those of the other white soldiers, generals, and housefolk, because he chooses to align himself with Native American ideology. Unlike General Duncan, who alongside Nathaniel has been tasked with escorting sisters Cora and Alice to Fort William Henry, Nathaniel seems level-headed, deliberate, and successful. Duncan is initially motivated by bloodlust, revenge, and the sheer excitement of chasing after Cora. Having been raised by a seemingly non-violent Mohican, the movie opens with Chingachgook praying over the carcass of a deer hunted only for sustenance. Nathaniel is Duncan's antithesis. Although both white, Duncan fights for vengeance, whereas Nathaniel fights for something much more profound, peace. Cora naturally gravitates towards the latter, which only serves to further anger Duncan. He, like many of the others around him, becomes curt and menacing. His decisions in battle gradually become less sound. The British Army ultimately underestimate the Native Americans that have allied themselves with French troops. In the end, it is the French who provoke a truce, showing mercy in the face of utter conquest. The same cannot be said for the other white soldiers whose actions are unflattering and contentious.
As has been previously discussed, the use of the theme of the embrace of native culture by white characters in film has many positive qualities. However, it can be argued that the use of this theme isn't as innocent, or even as positive, as it may seem at first. When evaluating this theme, one aspect that is particularly important to consider is the effect that this embrace and acceptance of native culture has on the white members of the audience. At first, for many of the reasons discussed previously, it would seem as though the response of white audiences could only be positive, but this is not necessarily the case at all. Some have argued that the theme of the embrace of native culture provides a kind of out for the white audience. In her book, Going Native, Indians in the American Cultural Imagination, Native scholar Shari Hundorf argues that since the white character's perspective provides the film's narrative center and thus the white audience's point of identification, it also symbolically purges white America of its responsibility for the terrible plights of Native Americans, past and present. While this argument may seem at first like a bit of a stretch, think about it for a second. When you watch movies like Dances with Wolves or Avatar, who do you identify with? Who are the good guys? In Dances with Wolves, the white military men are the bad guys. In Avatar, we grow to hate the greed and self-centeredness that drives the, primarily white, humans mining the moon of Pandora. In Last of the Dogmen, the white audience grows to despise the callous, cold, and arrogant sheriff and his gun-toting, white again, cronies. As the white audience, we long to identify with the natives, and the white characters who are embracing their culture while simultaneously breaking from the whites and the injustice they represent. We don't have to reconcile their treatment of the native peoples if we can just label them as the bad guys.
In continuation, even though films such as Dances with Wolves may show native culture in a positive manner, the cultural aspects of the film may be inaccurate. Inaccuracies in aspects of native culture may be intended by the filmmakers, or perhaps accidental due to the lack of knowledge surrounding the native culture. A filmmaker would purposely include inaccurate cultural aspects in a film because he or she wants the audience to see Native Americans a certain way. On the other hand, an example of an unintentional but still inaccurate depiction of native culture exists in Dances with Wolves. The Lakota in the film speak their own language. However, in reality, the Lakota people have different languages for males compared to females. But, in the film, all native actors speak the same female version of the Lakota language. While the effort is evident, the native culture still is not depicted with the degree of accuracy all people deserve. Many viewers do not question what they see in films. Peter Siegsas considers this idea when he asks, under what circumstances are they more or less likely to ask such a question? On what grounds do they judge that a film is an accurate representation of the past? Most people watch films uncritically. However, it is exhausting to question everything, especially from the perspectives of passive viewers who are going to the movies for entertainment. But surely the filmmakers know this. Perhaps they hold a higher responsibility to portray characters and people with more accuracy.
Aside from potential inaccuracies these films may have with regard to native cultures that they depict, we also often see an oversimplification of native culture. The native society that the white character is adopted into is almost never as deep or developed or as real as actual Native American cultures. This oversimplification is primarily the result of two things: lack of character development for native characters and lack of audience exposure to authentic aspects of native culture. In few films is the oversimplification of native culture so apparent as in Last of the Dogmen. The audience never has the privilege of experiencing any of the values, beliefs, or traditions of the Cheyenne society in the film, even though nearly a third of the film's story takes place within the Cheyenne village. In addition, Last of the Dogmen's lack of native character development is shocking. The only native character that has any sort of backstory or history is the village elder, and every single native character is underdeveloped, with no member of the tribe demonstrating more than one character trait. In Dances with Wolves, the story is no different. The Sioux community that Lieutenant Dunbar assimilates into represents a typical Plains tribe and fits the commonly used master narrative iconotype employed over and over again in 20th century film. In Avatar, you guessed it, the story repeats itself. Besides Sully's love interest, Neytiri, the remainder of the Na'vi tribe play insignificant roles in the story, and, apart from a few small scenes of exposition regarding their religion, the audience remains in the dark in a major way when it comes to the details of the culture of the Na'vi.
Lastly, many instances of joining native cultures emphasize that you must either be white or native, never both. There is no middle ground or a foot in each world. And although in some aspects this is a positive, since it looks down upon culture appropriation, it ultimately divides any links or bridges the two cultures may have. A good example of this is in Avatar, when Jake Sully has to become literally full Na'vi, or native, and completely abandons his previous culture. He can neither go back to it nor practice it any longer, as he becomes part of the tribe. Same with Dances with Wolves and Little Big Man, where both protagonists settle permanently in the isolated native culture. By dividing the two cultures, the films also put the two cultures at a never-ending war. Since we can only choose one or another, the two cultures are therefore competing, and at odds when, in reality, they are not. No one is better than the other, and neither is all-inclusive. This portrayal of division helps create an actual division as the audience observes the two cultures at odds, and therefore at war.
Ultimately, the theme of white integration into native cultures in film is simply, inherently, yet another form of cultural appropriation. We, as white filmmakers and audience members, are choosing how we wish to portray native peoples, and creating and viewing products that fit our picture of American Indians. As we discussed, this portrayal of Native culture is often inaccurate or oversimplified. In addition, it often promotes the separation of white and Native peoples by emphasizing differences between white and Native characters and societies depicted in the film. Finally, this theme also serves to release white audiences from the need to consider or contemplate the unjust treatment of Native peoples. These elements of each film, in turn, proceed to promote the continued perpetuation of stereotypes concerning Native cultures.
As with any other form of cultural appropriation, it is important to consider the integration of whites into Native culture in each of these films, with a focus on the effect that it has on the culture being appropriated. As well-informed viewers of such films, we need to be able to both recognize the fact that cultural theft is present and view the film while reflecting on the appropriation from the perspective of a member of the stolen culture. Doing so is the first step towards halting the endurance of cultural theft and serves to help facilitate the end of stereotypes that often result from appropriation.